You should have just signed the damn paper, Alina. This could have been so much easier. The voice belonged to my older sister, Victoria, my own flesh and blood. At that moment, I was pinned against the blood-smeared hardwood floor of my apartment. My brother-in-law's rough, calloused hands were locked around my throat, crushing my windpipe and cutting off every breath. His full weight pressed down on my body, while my left shoulder burned with blinding agony, completely dislocated after he had driven his knee into the joint. Victoria stood only a few feet away. She did not scream for him to stop. She did not call for help. She did not show even the smallest trace of panic as she watched her husband beat me nearly to death. She simply crossed her arms over her chest and stared down at me with a blank, lifeless expression. All of this was happening because I had refused to sign away my financial future to cover their mountain of debt. What neither of them knew was that, seconds before darkness swallowed my consciousness, my thumb found the emergency button hidden beneath the bezel of my tactical watch. I pressed it and held it down. 1 second. 2. 3. The silent SOS activated. 3 weeks earlier, my apartment in Fayetteville, North Carolina, had been the closest thing I possessed to a bunker. 4 quiet walls, sparse furniture, clean surfaces, and absolute order. After the noise, blood, and pressure of serving in the Army Medical Corps, silence was not a luxury to me. It was something I needed to survive. That afternoon, I sat at my glass dining table, field stripping my M17 service pistol. The sharp chemical scent of Hoppa's No. 9 solvent filled the room. The recoil spring was laid out in one precise position, the barrel in another, and every component rested exactly where it belonged, on the neoprene cleaning mat. Then I heard tires grinding over the gravel outside. A heavy V8 engine rumbled once before shutting off. I recognized the vehicle immediately. A black Lincoln Navigator. They did not knock. They never knocked. People who believed they owned you rarely bothered with basic respect. The front door swung open and struck the rubber wall stop with a dull thud. Victoria stepped inside first, bringing a heavy cloud of Chanel No. 5 with her. The perfume rolled through my living room and smothered the clean scent of gun oil. She wore a designer coat that probably cost more than my first car. Her nails were perfectly manicured. Her skin carried an unnatural spray-tanned glow, and every part of her appearance was designed to project wealth. The problem was that none of the wealth was real. Marcus lumbered in behind her. He was thick-necked and heavy-set, wearing a golf polo one size too small. The fabric stretched across his stomach and shoulders as he breathed through his mouth. He smelled like stale sweat and cheap beer. "Still living like a turtle in a shell, Lena?" Victoria asked with a smirk. Her eyes moved around my apartment, silently judging the lack of velvet cushions, oversized decorations, and expensive clutter. I did not answer. I kept my gaze on the weapon in front of me, removed the barrel from the slide, and wiped it carefully with a microfiber cloth. "Brought you some ribs," Marcus grunted. He dropped a foil-wrapped pan onto my clean granite counter. Grease immediately began leaking through the foil and spreading beneath it. The ribs were bait. Nobody drove 3 states to deliver a $5 tray of barbecue. The real reason for their visit appeared a moment later, when Marcus slapped a thick manila folder onto the glass table. He shoved it toward me with his palm. The folder slid across my cleaning mat and stopped inches from the disassembled pistol. I set down the cloth and opened it. Joint liability. Cross-collateralized loan. Mortgage restructuring. 18% annual interest. At the bottom of the final page was an empty line waiting for a cosigner. My stomach tightened. Victoria and Marcus had maxed out their credit cards, trying to maintain the appearance of suburban royalty. The Lincoln parked outside was a rental they treated like an owned vehicle. Their house in Ohio was underwater, and their accounts were drowning beneath years of reckless spending. They wanted to tie my captain's salary, military benefits, and flawless credit score to their collapsing financial life. "Your mom and dad bankrolled that fancy West Point ticket of yours," Marcus said, as he leaned over the table. "It's time you actually paid your dues to this family." He reached into his jeans pocket and removed a lighter. It was not a cheap plastic lighter from a gas station. It was a weathered silver Zippo, scratched from years of use. My father's Zippo. He had carried it through 2 combat tours. I remembered the weight of it in his hand when he stood beside me in uniform, and told me he was proud of the woman I had become. Now it rested in the sweaty grip of a man who had never earned the right to touch it. My jaw tightened. My spine became rigid. Marcus flipped open the lid. Clack. The scrape of the flint echoed through the bare room. He lit a cigarette in the middle of my apartment and blew a stream of gray smoke directly over the clean parts of my weapon. The gesture was deliberate. He had taken something sacred from my father's life and turned it into a cheap intimidation tactic. "Sign the paper, Alina," Victoria said. The false sweetness left her voice. What remained was pure entitlement. "Don't be selfish. We need this." I sat in the settling smoke and studied them. My pulse did not spike. My hands did not tremble. I had once stayed awake for 48 straight hours in a dusty, blood-soaked field hospital outside Kabul. I had ripped open trauma kits while 19-year-old soldiers bled through their uniforms on dirty cots. I knew what pressure felt like. I understood sacrifice. Victoria and Marcus did not see a combat veteran sitting in front of them. They did not see an army officer or even a human being. They saw an ATM with an 800-point credit score. They saw a resource they could sacrifice so Victoria could continue buying handbags she could not afford. I placed 2 fingers on the manila folder and pushed it back across the table. "This is financial suicide," I said. "I'm not signing it." Victoria's expression froze. Beneath the heavy foundation, the muscles in her face tightened. "Excuse me? You heard me. The answer is no. Take your garbage off my table." Marcus's face darkened to an ugly red. He stepped forward and drove his work boot into the leg of my dining chair. The chair shot backward. Wood screeched across the floorboards. "You're making a huge mistake," he spat. He pointed a nicotine-stained finger inches from my face. "Family takes care of family. You're going to regret this." He snatched the folder off the table, grabbed his cigarette, and stormed toward the front door. Victoria stared at me with a hatred that went far beyond money. Her lips pressed into a thin line before she turned and followed him outside. The door slammed hard enough to rattle the picture frames. I waited until the navigator's engine started. Then I stood, walked to the door, and threw the steel deadbolt into place. Click. Silence returned. The sour smell of tobacco lingered in the room, fighting against the gun solvent. The foil tray of ribs remained on the counter beside my smartphone. As I looked toward it, the phone's screen lit up. A message from Victoria. No words, only an image. I opened it. It was a photograph taken at my West Point graduation. My father stood beside me in his dress uniform, his chest lifted with pride, and a huge smile spreading across his weathered face. Across his chest, Victoria had added a block of bright red text. "Dad would be so damn ashamed of you right now." My thumb hovered over the screen. I did not cry. I did not throw the phone. I deleted the image and blocked her number. The next morning, I pulled on my boots and opened my front door. The smell reached me before I crossed the threshold. It was thick and sickeningly sweet, like rotting fruit drowned in cheap vanilla perfume. A funeral wreath sat in the center of my welcome mat. White lilies. The kind people placed beside a closed casket. A small card had been tucked among the dark green leaves. The handwriting was sharp and rushed. "I hope you change your mind before it's too late." It was a threat wrapped in funeral flowers. I grabbed the metal frame, dragged the wreath down the concrete breezeway, and threw it into the dumpster. It struck the bottom with a hollow, metallic thud. On Sunday night, at exactly 8, my phone vibrated against the kitchen counter. MOM appeared on the screen. I let it ring 3 times before answering and switching on the speaker. "Yeah?" A long, theatrical sigh came through the phone. She did not ask whether I was all right. She did not ask whether I had eaten or how work was going. The army could have returned me home in a body bag, and she would have complained about the shipping costs. "Alina," she said, sounding falsely exhausted. "I am just so tired of all this drama." "Then tell your golden child to pay her own bills." "Family helps family," she snapped, her exhaustion disappearing instantly. "Your father would be sick over the way you're acting. It's just a piece of paper. Sign it and keep the peace. I'm not taking responsibility for a $50,000 loan at 18%, so Victoria can keep leasing a luxury SUV." I said no. Another jagged sigh scraped through the speaker. "Why do you always have to make things so complicated, Alina?" "Complicated. That word tore open, something I had locked away for years. Suddenly, I was 19 again, standing at the top of the polished oak staircase in our old house in Ohio. Victoria was screaming at me. I no longer remembered whether it had been about a shirt she claimed I had ruined or some imagined insult. The reason had never mattered. What mattered was the moment she shoved me. Both of her palms struck my chest. My shoes slipped on the hardwood, and I fell backward into empty air. I remembered every violent impact. My ribs striking the edges of the oak steps, my head hitting the banister, my body tumbling until I landed at the bottom. Then came the wet, sickening pop from my left shoulder. The joint tore out of its socket. White-hot pain consumed my vision. I lay on the floor, gasping, clutching the useless arm hanging at my side. But the worst damage did not happen on the staircase. It happened 10 minutes later, in the passenger seat of my mother's rusted Chevrolet Malibu, while she drove me to the emergency room. I was sweating through my shirt and biting my lower lip hard enough to draw blood, because every bump in the road sent fire through my shoulder. My mother did not comfort me. Instead, she reached across the center console and grabbed my good arm. Her fingernails dug into my bicep. Her eyes were wide with fear, but she was not afraid for me. "Listen to me," she hissed, her breath smelling like stale coffee. "You tripped. You were clumsy, and you fell down the stairs. Do you understand? You are not ruining your sister's college track scholarship over an accident. You fell." My body had been collateral damage. My pain had been a minor inconvenience on Victoria's road to perfection. The memory dissolved, and my dark Fayetteville apartment returned around me. A phantom ache pulsed through my left shoulder. I reached up and rubbed the joint through my shirt. I had packed bullet wounds with gauze and treated Marines who had lost limbs in the desert. Yet my own mother had never once asked whether that shoulder had healed. "Alina?" she demanded through the speaker. "Are you even listening?" I stared at the glowing phone. She had never cared about the truth. She cared only about preserving the illusion of a perfect family. I ended the call and held down the power button until the screen went black. No more guilt. No more emotional extortion. I was finished bleeding for people who only complained about the stain I left on their floor. I walked into the dark living room without turning on a light. At the front window, I separated 2 plastic blinds with my fingers. The orange glow of the street lamp spilled across the road. A black Lincoln Navigator sat across from my building, half hidden in shadow. Its headlights were off, but thin clouds of white exhaust drifted from the tailpipe. The engine was running. Someone was watching my apartment. Tuesday morning, at 0500, I swallowed coffee so black and hot that it burned my throat. I laced my boots, gathered my gear, and walked toward the front door. My foot stopped an inch from the threshold. A piece of torn notebook paper had been pushed beneath the door during the night, directly under the steel deadbolt. I crouched without touching it. The handwriting was Victoria's. "Family is forever. Do not make a mistake." They truly believed a cheap imitation of a mafia threat would make me surrender. I retrieved tweezers from my medical kit, lifted the paper by one corner, and placed it on the granite counter. That afternoon, the North Carolina sun baked the asphalt in the base parking lot. I was approaching my truck when I noticed a second sheet of paper jammed beneath the driver's side windshield wiper. It had not been placed randomly. 2 years before my father died, he had attached a small circular decal to the lower corner of that windshield. It read, "Proud Veteran." I still remembered his calloused hand smoothing it against the glass. He had stepped back and smiled at me as though I had hung the moon. The new note had been taped directly over that decal. "You are not as tough as you think." Marcus had taken one of the few pure memories I still possessed of my father and deliberately covered it with a threat. Cold fury settled in the center of my chest. I did not tear the paper down or crush it in my fist. That was the reaction he wanted. Instead, I photographed the note from 3 angles, documenting its position and the tape over the decal. Then I used the tip of my key to lift it from the windshield without smearing the ink. They wanted to make me emotional. I gave them evidence. At 1 in the morning on Wednesday, a vibration in the floorboards pulled me out of sleep. A deep, rhythmic engine idle rolled through the silent street. I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling. The guttural growl of a large V8 was unmistakable. I slid from bed without turning on a light and moved silently across the hardwood, keeping my weight along the outer edges of my feet. At the living room window, I flattened my back against the wall and barely opened the blinds. The black Navigator was parked across the road beneath an oak tree. No headlights. Steady exhaust. A dark shape shifted behind the steering wheel. The orange tip of a cigarette flared briefly inside the cabin. Marcus. Most civilians would have panicked. They would have called 911 and waited for a patrol officer to arrive. I already knew how that conversation would go. Unless Marcus broke a window, struck me, or left blood on the pavement, the local police would label the situation a domestic disagreement. They would shine a flashlight into his vehicle, write a brief report, and tell us both to calm down. Then Marcus would drive away, knowing he had frightened me. I released the blinds and stepped back. My training took over. Observe. Orient. Decide. Act. I opened my tactical go bag and removed my military-issue infrared binoculars. Returning to the window, I crouched below the sill, braced my left elbow against the wood to eliminate movement, and raised the optics. The dark street transformed into sharp green detail. I saw sweat shining on Marcus's forehead. I saw his jaw working against the cigarette filter. I lowered the binoculars toward the vehicle's front bumper. The license plate became perfectly clear. Ohio registration. URM Neitsaskilensvenkettu. I checked my watch. 1:12 in the morning. I opened a notebook. Subject. Marcus Best. Vehicle. Black Lincoln Navigator. Ohio plate. JRM. 492. Arrival. 0108 hours. He remained outside for 45 minutes, smoking and staring at my darkened windows, convinced he was a predator waiting for frightened prey to move. He had no idea he had become the subject of a surveillance record. At 1:57, the Navigator rolled away. Departure. 0157 hours. The next morning, pale gray light spread over the sky as I stood in my kitchen wearing blue nitrile gloves. I placed the note from beneath my door into a heavy-duty evidence bag. I placed the windshield note into another. After sealing both bags, I wrote the date, time, and location of discovery on each one with a black permanent marker. 2 threats, 2 pieces of preserved physical evidence. I removed the gloves, threw them away, carried the bags to my truck, and placed them on the passenger seat. I did not need a local patrol officer. Police usually responded after a crime had occurred. I needed legal firepower before the violence began. The law office of Chloe Vance did not smell like justice. It smelled like stale black coffee, floor wax, and the metallic heat of an overworked laser printer. I sat upright in a high-backed leather chair, across from Chloe's mahogany desk. My feet were planted firmly, knees shoulder-width apart, and my back did not touch the cushion. Chloe offered no water, tissues, or empty sympathy. She studied the evidence bags on her desk and the surveillance log beside them. Her dark eyes were sharp and clinical. She lifted a ceramic mug and took a slow sip. "The local police will not do anything yet, Alina," she said. "You call dispatch, and they send a tired patrol officer. He looks at Marcus, looks at you, and writes this off as a civil dispute between relatives." He sat outside my bedroom window with his engine running for almost an hour at 1 in the morning, and he did not break a window or raise a fist. Under county law, he was a man sitting inside a vehicle on a public road. I looked toward the leather-bound law books covering the shelves behind her. I was spending $300 an hour to sit across from a stranger, but that stranger was the only person making a serious effort to protect me. My sister wanted to drain my finances to preserve her fictional lifestyle. My mother wanted me to accept the abuse and maintain family peace. Chloe wanted to build a steel cage around the people threatening me. "What's the play?" I asked. She leaned forward and tapped a manicured nail against one of the evidence bags. "We bait the trap. A permanent restraining order requires a mountain of proof. We need clean audio, high-definition video, and undeniable evidence of trespass. When they cross the line, their attorneys must have no room to breathe." I understood the objective immediately. "Install a professional camera system," she continued. "Independent cellular connection, remote cloud storage, and no local hard drive they can destroy. Build a perimeter. I rose from the chair and nodded once. Consider it done. Instead of returning to the base, I drove to a commercial electronics warehouse on the industrial edge of town. Fluorescent tubes buzzed above long aisles that smelled of damp cardboard and sterile plastic. I ignored the inexpensive consumer cameras. I selected a professional high-definition infrared surveillance system with cellular backup, secure remote server storage, and automatic cloud synchronization if the Wi-Fi connection failed. I paid cash. I did not want the purchase appearing in my primary banking records. Victoria and Marcus had begun treating me like a hostile target. I intended to defend myself with the discipline I had learned in hostile territory. By 1800 hours, my apartment had become a forward operating base. I moved the furniture and created clear lines of sight from the front entrance through the living room and into the kitchen. The primary camera disappeared among the thick green leaves of a potted fern on the bookshelf. From there, it captured the doorway, living room, and hallway. I shut off the overhead lights. The room went black. Inside the fern, a tiny red light blinked. The infrared lens was active. At the front door, I modified the doorbell housing and installed a reinforced exterior camera with a view of the parking lot and concrete breezeway. There were no blind spots. My family believed they were intimidating the frightened younger sister they had spent years conditioning into silence. They had forgotten that I was an army captain who had spent my 20s learning to secure medical positions in foreign combat zones. The last piece of the system went onto my wrist. I removed my Garmin tactical watch and connected it to my laptop with an encrypted data cable. Using a custom macro, I mapped an emergency protocol to the primary side button. A 3-second press would send my precise GPS coordinates and a silent SOS to county dispatch. A secondary alert would reach Chloe's personal phone at the same time. It was my dead man's switch. I disconnected the cable and tightened the nylon band around my left wrist. Then I checked the door locks, the live video feeds, the cellular backup, and the cloud storage status. Every indicator showed green. My perimeter was secure. A moment later, my phone vibrated on the counter. Victoria had sent another photograph. It showed the peeling wooden front door of our mother's house in Ohio. The message beneath it read, "Sunday family dinner. Mom expects you. You better be there." The steel deadbolt on my own door suddenly felt useless. They were not planning to break into my fortress. They wanted me to leave it willingly and walk into theirs. After 8 hours on Interstate 77, I switched off my truck's engine in front of my mother's house. The grill clicked as it cooled in the freezing Ohio air. My lower back ached from the drive, but I rolled my shoulders back and straightened my spine. I walked along the cracked concrete path and pushed open the cheap plywood door. A wall of overheated air struck me. The house smelled like burned pot roast, stale carpet, and canned beer. An NFL game roared from the living room. The television shut off the moment I entered. Silence dropped over the house. The room was full. My mother, Victoria, Marcus, Uncle Richard, Aunt Susan, several cousins. A room filled with my own blood. Not one person greeted me. They stared at my dark jeans and combat boots as if I had arrived for sentencing. Uncle Richard approached first. Sour cigar smoke and Old Spice clung to his clothes. He seized my elbow with more force than necessary and pulled me toward the hallway. "You're out of line," he muttered. "The army made you too rigid, too hard. You need to back off your sister." I looked down at his hand. He released me. "Men don't like women who refuse to compromise," he continued. "Stop being so stubborn and help your family." My military rank, combat experience, and entire adult life had been reduced to the behavior of an unruly little girl who needed correction. I did not argue. I walked past him into the dining room. Dinner felt like an execution. They placed me at the far end of the long wooden table, in a wobbly chair beside a drafty window. I sat with my posture straight, and my hands folded in my lap. Everyone else began eating. Bowls of mashed potatoes, greasy green beans, and overcooked meat passed around the table. Arms reached across my face, but nobody handed me a serving dish. Nobody offered me food. They were isolating me deliberately. Forks scraped against cheap porcelain. People chewed with their mouths open. The wet sounds filled the room. Aunt Susan wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and spoke loudly to Victoria while pretending I was not there. "Did I tell you about your cousin Jimmy? He took a second mortgage on his house and gave the money to his sister so she could keep her salon open." Marcus grunted approvingly through a mouthful of meat. "That's what real blood does," Aunt Susan continued. Her eyes shifted toward me. "Real family steps up. They don't hoard their money while their own flesh and blood struggles." Every sentence was aimed directly at me. They were constructing a story in which I was the greedy villain because I refused to become their financial hostage. I stared at the empty, chipped plate in front of me. At the head of the table, my mother watched the attack unfold without interfering. Eventually, she dropped her fork. It clattered loudly against her plate. She lifted a paper napkin and dabbed at eyes that contained no tears. "Alina," she sighed. "I'm exhausted. I'm done with all of this." She paused until everyone was watching. "If your father were alive, he would be ashamed. He would be sick to his stomach watching you destroy this family over a piece of paper." My jaw clenched hard enough for something to pop near my ear. My father had surrendered his health to desert air and military service. He had taught me the meaning of honor. Now my mother was using his grave as a weapon. My right hand closed around the fork. I slammed it onto the plate. The metal struck porcelain with a sharp crack. The entire table flinched. I pushed back my chair, stood, and walked through the sliding glass door onto the rear porch. Freezing wind cut through my cotton shirt. I gripped the wooden railing and drew the icy air into my lungs until my heartbeat slowed. The door rattled open behind me. Victoria stepped onto the porch, carrying a glass of cheap red wine. Once the door closed, the false victim expression disappeared from her face. What remained was hard and cruel. She moved beside me at the railing. "See?" she whispered. "Nobody cares about your rules, Alina. Nobody is on your side." I kept my eyes on the dark tree line. She leaned closer. Sour alcohol coated her breath. "You think you can walk away? If you don't sign that paper, I will make you get on your knees and beg to sign it. Do you understand me?" I turned and looked directly into her eyes. I did not blink. I did not answer. I walked down the wooden steps and returned to my truck. At 11 that night, I drove south on Interstate 77. The cab was dark, except for the cold glow of the dashboard. Both hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles appeared white. When I had left the porch, Victoria had not screamed or followed me. She had stood in the freezing air and smiled. That silence told me everything. The gaslighting and psychological pressure were finished. Her smile had not been surrender. It had been the silence before an explosion. They were coming for blood. On Tuesday night, at 2200 hours, my Fayetteville apartment was completely still. I sat at the kitchen counter, cleaning the optic lens of my service pistol when my phone vibrated. "Marcus," I answered without speaking. "You have 5 minutes to open that door and hand over the contract," he slurred. Heavy, wet breaths filled the line. "Or I'm coming through the damn wall to get it." The call ended. My hands remained steady. My body shifted instantly into condition red. I picked up the M17, pulled back the slide, and released it. Clack. A 9mm hollow point round, seated in the chamber. I placed the weapon on the counter, hidden from the doorway, but within reach. The cloud server indicator on my phone glowed green. The camera inside the fern was recording. The exterior camera was active. White headlights swept across my closed blinds. The navigator's engine shut down. A door slammed outside. Heavy, uneven footsteps climbed the concrete breezeway. I stepped into the shadow of the hallway and planted my feet shoulder-width apart. My left thumb rested on the emergency button of my watch. The first impact struck the front door like an explosion. The frame buckled inward. Marcus was using his body as a battering ram. The second blow splintered the pine around the steel strike plate. The deadbolt groaned. The third impact tore the plate from the frame, ripped away a section of drywall, and sent the door crashing against the interior wall. Marcus charged into the apartment, carrying an aluminum baseball bat. His face was dark red. His eyes were wide and bloodshot. Stale beer, nicotine, and sweat surrounded him. He saw me in the hallway and rushed forward. The bat swept toward my ribs in a violent horizontal arc. The narrow hallway prevented a full swing, and the tip tore through the drywall, reducing its speed. I ducked under it. I could not avoid the rest of him. Marcus dropped the bat. It struck the hardwood with a metallic crash. Then he drove all 250 pounds of his body into my chest. The impact emptied my lungs and slammed my spine against the hallway wall. Before I could pivot, his hand closed around my hair. He jerked my head backward and smashed my skull against the plaster. Then he attacked the place he knew had already been broken. He shifted his weight and drove his knee directly into my left shoulder. The same joint Victoria had dislocated on the staircase 8 years earlier. A wet pop sounded inside my body. The shoulder tore from its socket. Agony burst behind my eyes, in a wave of blinding white. My arm went dead and hung uselessly at my side. My legs collapsed beneath me. Marcus followed me to the floor. He pinned my hips beneath his knees and wrapped both hands around my throat. His palms smelled like motor oil and sweat. He squeezed. Air vanished. Pressure exploded through my skull. With my one functioning arm, I clawed at his forearms. My fingernails tore into his skin as I tried to pull his hands away. It was the same right hand that had basted the Thanksgiving turkey I served him the previous year. He gritted his teeth and tightened his grip. Black spots gathered at the edges of my vision. The room tilted. A figure stepped through the shattered doorway. Victoria carefully crossed the splintered wood in a spotless beige trench coat. There was no panic on her face. She stopped a few feet away and looked down at me while her husband crushed the life out of my body. Then she crossed her arms. "You should have just signed the damn paper, Alina," she said calmly. "This could have been so much easier." Darkness closed around me. My left arm was useless, but my thumb could still move against the side of my watch. I pressed the button. 1, 2, 3. The SOS locked. My coordinates transmitted. The response came in the form of sirens. A high, mechanical wail tore through the night. Tires screamed against asphalt outside my building. Blue and red lights flashed through the broken doorway and strobed across the living room walls. Marcus froze. The rage in his bloodshot eyes vanished and was replaced by terror. His hands loosened. Air ripped into my lungs in a jagged, burning gasp. Victoria's empty expression shattered. Her jaw dropped, and her eyes darted toward the police lights. "Get up!" she shrieked. "Get to the car, Marcus!" He scrambled off my chest. Without his weight crushing me, I rolled onto my right side and tried to breathe. My left arm lay motionless against the floorboards. Victoria stepped over the debris, careful not to let her expensive coat touch the splintered wood. She did not look back at the blood, soaking through my gray Army physical training shirt. She cared only about escape. Heavy tactical boots pounded along the breezeway. Sergeant Hayes entered through the destroyed doorway. 2 military police officers followed him, their hands near their holstered weapons. Hayes did not waste time on expressions of shock or pity. He knelt beside me and assessed the blood, damaged doorframe, baseball bat, and unnatural position of my shoulder. "Captain," he said in a steady voice, "the perimeter is locked down. Medics are coming up the stairs." My family had treated me like an ATM and a punching bag. To the people entering that room, I was still an officer. My life had value. Emergency medical personnel rushed inside and dropped a large orange trauma bag onto the floor. As they prepared a cervical collar and backboard, I lifted my right hand and caught Hayes by the sleeve. He leaned closer. Swallowing felt like dragging glass through my throat. "The Fern," I rasped, pointing toward the bookshelf. "The doorbell. Independent cloud uplink. Everything is recorded." Hayes followed my finger and saw the tiny red indicator inside the plant. A cold, satisfied expression crossed his face. He removed a notebook from his uniform and clicked his pen. "Understood, Captain. We'll secure the hardware." The medics lifted me onto the backboard. As they carried me into the breezeway, I heard yellow crime scene tape tearing from a cardboard roll. It sounded like a trap snapping shut. 2 hours later, I lay inside Womack Army Medical Center. The emergency department smelled of iodine, bleach, and rubbing alcohol. Cold air from the ceiling vents froze the sweat on my skin. A large IV catheter had been inserted into the back of my right hand, and saline flowed into my veins like liquid ice. The door opened. Chloe Vance entered in a fitted black blazer, carrying a leather legal pad. She brought no flowers. She did not hold my hand or promise everything would be all right. She stood at the foot of the bed and examined the bandages, securing my left shoulder against my chest. State troopers deployed spike strips against the Lincoln just beyond the county line, she said. Marcus registered .12 on the breath test. He's in a holding cell wearing orange. I stared at the ceiling tiles. And to Victoria? She claimed she was a terrified bystander. She cried and told the arresting officers that her husband simply lost his temper. Chloe gave a short, humorless laugh. You look like hell, Captain, but we're going to bury them. 2 days later, pain medication had reduced the fire in my shoulder to a deep, constant throb. The lead investigator from the Army Criminal Investigation Division entered my private recovery room. He was broad-shouldered, dressed in a plain gray suit, and carried a shock-proof military tablet. He pulled a chair beside the bed and placed the device on the tray table. Captain Best, I want you to see the locked evidentiary file before copies are transferred to the district attorney. He activated the screen and pressed play. The infrared recording from the Fern appeared in crisp black and white. It showed the doorframe splintering, Marcus entering with the aluminum bat, his charge through the living room, the tackle, the knee striking my shoulder, my body collapsing, his hands closing around my throat. Then Victoria entered the frame. She stood over me with her arms crossed as I fought for air. The microphone captured her voice clearly. You should have just signed the damn paper, Alina. This could have been so much easier. The investigator paused the recording on Victoria's blank expression. He closed the tablet with a sharp snap. I've worked domestic assault cases for 15 years, he said, his anger tightly controlled. I have never seen a planned attack this cold. They believed they could walk away from it. He stood and tucked the tablet beneath his arm. We have them, Captain, dead to rights. I looked down at the bandages around my shoulder. The pain remained. The betrayal remained. The fear was gone. The civilian game of manipulation had ended. The rules had changed, and the board belonged to me now. The Cumberland County Courthouse smelled of lemon furniture polish, old paper, and nervous sweat. I sat at the plaintiff's table in my Army Class A uniform. My back did not touch the chair. Dark green wool rested stiffly across my shoulders. Brass buttons reflected the fluorescent lights, and my service ribbons were perfectly aligned. Across the aisle, Marcus wore a pale gray suit that looked as though it had come from a clearance rack. He hunched forward in his chair, performing the role of a broken and exhausted family man. The greater betrayal sat behind him. My mother, Uncle Richard, and Aunt Susan occupied the gallery bench directly behind Marcus and Victoria. They had formed a visible wall of blood relatives in support of the man who had tried to crush my throat. My mother wore a conservative black dress and kept her eyes fixed on the floor. She had chosen her side. The defense attorney approached the podium and adjusted his silk tie. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began, what happened was tragic, but it was not the tragedy the prosecution wants you to believe. He pointed toward me. Captain Alina Best is a highly trained Army Medical Corps officer and combat veteran. We honor her service, but we must also acknowledge the psychological consequences of military trauma, pressure, and post-traumatic stress. His strategy was obvious. He portrayed me as an unstable soldier who had exploded during an ordinary family disagreement. He claimed Marcus feared for his life and had used only the force necessary to restrain a dangerous, highly trained combatant who attacked first. Marcus kept his head lowered and rubbed his eyes with thick fingers. I remained still. I did not shake my head, glare at him, or react. I allowed them to deepen the hole. When the defense finished, Chloe rose slowly. She buttoned her black blazer and picked up a small flash drive. Your Honor, the plaintiff calls no rebuttal witnesses. We request only that Plaintiff's Exhibit 1 be entered into evidence. Surveillance footage from the night of the assault. The defense attorney frowned. Marcus shifted in his chair. A large projection screen descended from the ceiling. The overhead lights dimmed, and the projector began to hum. The recording filled the screen. The courtroom watched my apartment door explode inward. They watched Marcus enter with the bat. They saw his body drive me into the hallway wall. They saw his knee crush my shoulder. The jury became silent. They watched him pin me against the floor and wrap both hands around my throat. Chloe allowed 10 silent seconds of the attack to play. Then she turned toward the technician. Original audio. The speakers crackled. The sounds of the struggle filled the courtroom, heavy breathing, grunts, impacts, and the sickening pop of my shoulder leaving its socket. Victoria stepped into view. She stood over my body, arms crossed, face empty. Her words rang through the courtroom. "You should have just signed the damn paper, Alina. This could have been so much easier." A collective gasp tore through the jury box. An older woman covered her mouth with a trembling hand. The defense's illusion disintegrated. Marcus was no frightened family man. He was a predator. Victoria was no helpless witness. She was part of the plan. Marcus's face turned pale. Victoria slid lower in her chair, her skin burning red. Behind them, Uncle Richard froze. My mother stared at the screen with her mouth open. For the first time, the truth could not be rewritten, minimized, or hidden behind the walls of a family home. It was displayed in high definition for an entire courtroom. The remainder of the trial was a collapse. Chloe called Victoria to the witness stand and dismantled her story in less than 10 minutes. Under direct questioning and confronted with the recording, Victoria broke down and admitted that the pressure campaign had been designed to force my signature onto the loan documents covering their underwater mortgage and debts. The judge did not hesitate. The gavel struck the bench like a gunshot. Marcus was convicted of aggravated assault and extortion and remanded to federal custody. Victoria was found responsible for conspiracy to commit extortion. She received 5 years of supervised probation and a permanent restraining order, barring her from contacting or approaching me. Steel cuffs closed around Marcus's wrists. Click, click. The bailiff led him through a side door. He did not look back. Victoria remained at the defense table, sobbing into her hands as the image she had built for herself collapsed in public. I rose and smoothed the front of my Class A jacket. Then I walked down the center aisle toward the oak courtroom doors. Before leaving, I stopped and looked toward the gallery. My mother stood, clutching a black leather purse. Our eyes met. She did not approach me. She did not apologize. She lowered her gaze to the floor, unable to face either the monster she had protected or the daughter she had abandoned. I pushed open the doors and entered the cold courthouse hallway. Marcus's sentence had begun. Mine, in a different way, was only starting. 1 month after the verdict, my Fayetteville apartment contained nothing but cardboard boxes and echoes. Packing tape filled the air with a sharp chemical odor. I sat on a rolled olive drab sleeping bag in the middle of the empty living room. There had been no angry voicemail, guilty text, or call from anyone who shared my last name. The Best family had severed contact completely. At first, I believed the silence was punishment, a final version of the silent treatment designed to make me feel isolated until I apologized for helping send Marcus to prison. As I stared at the bare walls, a colder truth became clear. They had not abandoned me because they were angry. They had abandoned me because the ATM was closed. My accounts were protected. My credit was beyond their reach. I could no longer finance the lifestyle they pretended to possess. Once I stopped being useful, I stopped existing to them. The silence was not a weapon. It was proof. I had never truly been treated as a daughter or sister. I had been treated as a resource. The next morning, frost coated my truck's windshield. I walked to the rusted cluster of mailboxes outside the apartment complex and opened mine with a brass key. Only one envelope lay inside. It was made of thick, cream-colored stationery. I recognized the slanted handwriting immediately. My mother's. I stood in the freezing parking lot, staring at my name in dark blue ink. My breath formed pale clouds in front of me. Beneath years of military discipline and survival instinct, a microscopic piece of hope stirred. Perhaps seeing Marcus imprisoned had finally forced her to recognize what had happened. Perhaps she was writing to apologize for my bruised throat, my dislocated shoulder, or the years she had spent sacrificing me to protect Victoria. I returned to the apartment and stood at the granite counter. With a steel letter opener, I cut through the envelope and removed 2 sheets of heavy paper. Several places on the pages were warped by dried tears. I read the first paragraph. The small flicker of hope died. She never asked about my recovery. She never asked whether I woke during the night, unable to breathe, reliving Marcus's hands around my throat. Instead, she had written 2 pages of self-pity. She described Marcus's calculated assault as a regrettable mistake. She called my decision to involve military police an overreaction. She complained about the social pressure Victoria faced in Ohio now that her husband was a convicted felon. The neighbors were talking. The family reputation had been damaged. Somehow, in her version, I was responsible for the destruction. The final paragraph contained the real demand. I hope you can find it in your heart to let go of this anger. I hope you can forgive so our family can go back to how it was. I read those words twice. Go back to how it was. Go back to being their shield. Go back to sacrificing myself so Victoria could remain untouched. My mother did not want forgiveness. She wanted silence. She wanted me to return to my assigned position, absorb the damage, and pretend the blood on my floor had been nothing more serious than spilled wine. It was toxic forgiveness, the demand that I swallow poison, so the people who poured it would not feel uncomfortable. Standing alone in the empty kitchen, I realized the anger I had carried for the previous month was gone. In its place was cold clarity. Holding on to rage was another way of keeping them inside my life. I walked to the corner where my father's oak keepsake box rested on top of a stack of moving cartons. I did not reach for my phone. I did not write a furious response or attempt to explain reality to a woman committed to denying it. There was no argument left to win. I folded the letter in half and pressed my thumb firmly along the crease. Then I opened the brass latch on the keepsake box and placed the letter beside my father's tarnished Zippo. I closed the lid. Clack. The latch snapped into place with the sound of finality. The family bloodline had derailed long ago. For the first time, I was stepping away from the tracks. The following morning, I boarded a one-way flight to Texas. The sun over Fort Sam Houston beat down like a hammer. Heat rose from the cracked concrete parade field and radiated through the soles of my combat boots. The air tasted of hot asphalt and bleached canvas. I did not hide inside the air-conditioned officers' quarters. I stood at the front of a humid lecture hall, facing 80 young Army combat medics. They expected instruction on tourniquets, chest seals, and arterial hemorrhage. I gave them that. I demonstrated how to pack a gunshot wound with hemostatic gauze until their hands and knuckles ached. Then I changed the projector slide. I began teaching them about a different kind of bleeding, the slow psychological drain inflicted by people wearing the faces of parents, siblings, and spouses. An enemy combatant will shoot you in the chest, I told the room. A toxic relative will drain your bank account, destroy your credit, and demand that you thank them for the privilege. They will use your uniform, loyalty, and sense of duty as weapons against you. Learn to recognize the ambush before you are bleeding on your own living room floor. My court record did not remain buried in a Cumberland County archive. The Judge Advocate General's Corps obtained the transcript and transformed it into a mandatory training module. The best precedent. That became the title printed across the manuals. My case was used as a nationwide study of financial coercion, psychological extortion, and escalating domestic violence within military families. The shame I had once carried about Victoria and my mother disappeared in the Texas heat. I took the remains of my ruined family and forged them into something useful. I was no longer the woman choking beneath Marcus on the floor. I became a shield for service members being exploited by the people who had raised them. 14 months later, I stood inside an auditorium at the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia. The air was cold, filtered, and precise. The room smelled of polished brass, expensive floor wax, and dry-cleaned wool. Hundreds of senior officers filled the tiered seats. Silver stars gleamed on collars, and embroidered eagles marked shoulders throughout the auditorium. I crossed the stage in my Class A uniform and stopped behind a heavy oak podium. After adjusting the microphone, I looked across the sea of green, blue, and white uniforms. My shoulders were square. My spine was straight. "Blood is not a life sentence," I said. My voice carried to the rear wall. We train soldiers to survive hostile interrogation. We teach them to endure physical torture and captivity, but we send them home without preparing them for the emotional extortion waiting at their own dinner tables. The auditorium became completely still. Sometimes, the most courageous act a soldier will ever perform is not taking a bullet on a foreign battlefield. It is looking into the eyes of the people who share their last name and saying one word. I paused. No. I stepped away from the microphone. Every officer in the auditorium rose. The applause struck me like rolling artillery. I did not bow or smile. I gave a single sharp nod, turned away from the stage lights, and descended the carpeted steps. At the bottom, a young Marine Corps lieutenant moved into my path. Her dress uniform was immaculate, but her hands trembled. One tear ran down her cheek and fell onto the back of her white glove. She gripped my forearm. "Captain," she whispered, her voice breaking beneath the weight of a secret she had carried too long. "Thank you. I'm going back to my quarters. I'm calling my father, and I'm cutting off his access to my direct deposit. No more." I looked at her shaking hands, and the new determination burning behind her tears. "Hold the line, Lieutenant," I said quietly. "Do not let them back inside the wire." She nodded and released my arm. As she walked away, her back became straight. I pushed open the glass doors and stepped into the bright Virginia daylight. Warm wind touched my face. The judge's gavel in North Carolina had placed a violent man behind steel bars, but that conviction had not freed me. This had. My own refusal to break. My decision to stop confusing blood with loyalty. My willingness to say no and accept the silence that followed. My family had wrapped chains around my throat. In the end, I used those same chains to break open the locks for everyone who came after me.